Hello, thank you for joining us today and welcome to the ESHA Research webinar on the 2016 Nutrition Labeling Guidelines Review. My name is Ben, as always joined by Alicia. We're going to go through that topic today. I wanted to point something out really quick, and I'll point it out again in a couple minutes. If you have any questions along the way, ask those questions. There's a question box inside of the GoToWebinar panel. Ask those questions along the way. We've already gotten a handful, so we have people that are gonna stand by to answer questions. But if you wait to the very end when we're starting to do the Q&A at the end, there's a good chance that we'll get a huge flood of them. We may run out of time to answer all the questions live. So make sure you ask those questions as they come up. As we always do, a little background on ESHA and Genesis. So ESHA was established in 1981. As one of the very first nutrition software solutions. Today we have a number of software solutions, including Genesis R&D Food, which was the prime focus today, the Genesis Supplements application, our food processor, nutrition and diet analysis software, and consulting services. As I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the Genesis Food software today, which was released in 1991 and is designed for meeting industry challenges and developing those nutrition labels and regulatory compliance. We have a couple webinars coming up. On July 31st, we have one that will be working with proprietary blends in the Genesis supplement software. So if you are a supplement manufacturer and either you have the supplements application or maybe you're just looking at the possibility of adding it to the food program too, take a look at that webinar and see what supplements is all about or learn a bit more about it. We have a calculating PDCAAS for percent DV of protein coming up August 14th. And then on September 25th, always a popular topic, we've done it a couple of times before, but the top Genesis R&D user Q&A. So getting a bunch of questions, probably a lot from today, and going through those questions as they come in. If you'd like to register for any of our upcoming webinars or view any of them in the past, visit our website to see those. As I mentioned, please note that you can ask those questions along the way. Also, this webinar is being recorded. We will have a copy of it on our website as soon as it is over or not too long after it's over. And all of our past webinars are available on our website, and of course future ones available to sign up on our website. So again, ask those questions along the way. I can't stress that enough. Our agenda for today, where we're going to cover compliance states, changes to nutrient requirements, looking at the different nutrients like dietary fiber and added sugars, serving sizes, racks, all of the new regulatory pieces for those 2016 regulations, dual column labels, best practices, and probably quite a few different questions that we'll answer when we get to the end here as well. We're going to look at quite a bit of information, just kind of raw information on the regulations, and then we are also going to go into the Genesis software to show that off as well. So Alicia is going to go through a lot of the kind of slideshow type topics, and then she'll pass it back over to me to get into software. So I'll go ahead and let Alicia take it away.
All right, thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, we have a lot of content to cover, so we'll get through that. For today's webinar, like Ben said, we're going to highlight the 2016 U.S. labeling regulations. You know, they've been evolving for the past 3+ years. We've seen a lot of changes and adaptations, clarifications as folks have come to understand and question some of these regulations. So we're going to just catch you up on what's been happening most recently with the latest guidance. And just want to point out there are resources available here in the webinar. You should see in the go-to window a few PDFs that are attached. So you can certainly open those or download those later. And as Ben mentioned, we will send out a recording of the webinar as well as the slide deck. So all of you attending today, or if you registered and couldn't be present live, you will receive a follow-up email that provides that information. Much of this will be a repeat of information that we presented in previous webinars. Like I said, we wanted to kind of catch you up to date on the latest guidance and just some clarifications on some of the regulations. And I'll go over regulations, and there will be some direct features and settings tie-ins that Ben will highlight in the Genesis R&D software itself. I do want to emphasize that our Genesis R&D training sessions, the classes that we offer, cover this information and the uses of Genesis R&D in great detail. So if these topics are completely new to you, or if you just need to dive deeper into the details of the U.S. food labeling and how to create or transition to the 2016 labels using Genesis R&D, I highly encourage you to look into the formal classes that we offer. And you can find the training schedule and registration information on the ESHA website. The 2016 labeling regulations replaces guidelines set out by the 1990 NLEA rules. The most obvious difference you'll see on the new labels is that calories is presented in that big, bold text. And you'll see changes to mandatory nutrients, serving size reference amounts, and additional allowances have also occurred. We will continue to include both the 1990 and the 2016 label formats in Genesis R&D for some time. We want to give you plenty of opportunity to transition your labels, solidify your records, and complete your documentation. Initially, the compliance date for the new U.S. labels was July of 2018, but in May of 2018, the FDA extended compliance dates for the 2016 formats. The compliance dates for the 2016 labels are January 1st, 2020 for companies with 10 million or more in annual food sales, and January 1st, 2021 for companies with less than $10 million in annual food sales. The compliance dates are based on when the food is labeled, when that package is labeled. So when the label is placed on the package. So we'll continue to see packaged foods on the market with the 1990 label even after the compliance date. So just know that when you're labeling your products, if your foods are packaged and labeled on or after January 1st, 2020 or January 1st, 2021, if that applies to you, then you must use the 2016 label format. And there is one other exception for single ingredient sugar products, but we'll get to that in a few slides. If you're wondering what size your label must be, the FDA labels aren't really designed in terms of specific label dimensions. The format of the label is determined by the available space on the package. And while specific fonts are used in FDA labeling examples as references, the CFR verbiage allows flexibility in the font style that you can use. However, the CFR states that labels must present information in a text style that is easy for consumers to read. And text sizes are spelled out quite clearly, as you can see here. The label instructions list minimum and relative font sizes to work with. So here you can see wording like no smaller than certain point size. And just know in Genesis R&D, all of this formatting is automatic. So once you start working with labels, we provide you with compliant text, font, and size. Diving into the content changes of the label, we have changes to the nutrients that must be and that can occur within the nutrition facts label. New mandatory nutrients on the 2016 label are added sugars, vitamin D, and potassium. Vitamins A and C were mandatory in the 1990 label, but they are voluntary nutrients on the 2016 label. Choline and fluoride are allowed now as voluntary, while other carbohydrates and calories from fat are not allowed to be listed on the 2016 label. Some of the nutrients reported on the label experienced an increase to the daily value, or that number that is used to calculate the percent dB. These are listed here with the changes and new dB amounts. I'm going to go through these slides a little quickly, but like I said, we'll send you a copy of the slides following the recording, and we've referred to these changes in previous webinars. And as a reminder that even if you've made no change to your formula or serving size and had no changes to the nutritional content of your product, you might see a change in the percent dB listed on the label. Here's an example with potassium. See on both labels that potassium is listed as 1,750 milligrams. The 1990 label shows 50% DV because the daily value used to calculate the percent is 3,500 milligrams. Whereas on the 2016 label, the percent DV is listed as 35% based on that new daily value of 4,700 milligrams. Some of the nutrients reported on the label experienced a decrease to the daily value. So with no change to the quantitative value per serving, we may see an increase in percent DV for these nutrients. And here's an example demonstrating that case. Here, both labels show carbohydrate at 30 grams per serving. The 1990 label reports 10% DV because the daily value used to calculate the percent DV is 300 grams. For the 2016 label, however, we see 11% DV because the daily value for the 2016 label is now 275 grams. Some of the nutrients reported on the label experienced a change in the unit in which the nutrient is reported. And you can see these listed here. We have several blogs about specific conversions used for these nutrients to help you manually calculate the new nutrients or the new units. But Genesis also includes a nutrient calculator tool that can help you convert values from one unit to another. For some of these, like vitamin D, the conversion is a direct calculation. For others, you will be prompted to select the description or the factor that's used. For instance, with vitamin A or vitamin E, there are different forms of these. For vitamin A, Genesis will ask if the vitamin A in your food is coming from all plant or from all animal source. And based on your selection of those, the appropriate conversion is applied. If you have vitamin A that's coming from a combination of animal and plant sources, then you may need more information from your supplier, and you may need to manually enter values or manually calculate values and then enter those into Genesis. When using the nutrient calculator tool, you can choose to use the auto calculation option, which immediately shows you available calculations as you go. For instance, if you enter total dietary fiber, it may prompt you how much of this is beneficial, and we're going to calculate dietary fiber 2016. Or you can choose to select the calculates nutrients button, the calculate nutrients button in the software, and that will show you all of the conversion options based on the nutrient data that is being reported. So if you've entered all of your work or created your recipe and then choose the calculate nutrients button, all of the conversion options will be shown for you. As part of the 2016 label regulations, we also see changes to the reference amounts customarily consumed, or the RAC, for some food categories. This is one of our ESHA cheat sheets that discusses changes with the RAC and related serving size rules. This also provides you with the CFR reference 101.12, where you will find the RAC and a table that lists food categories and how to declare those. Just a reminder that the RAC is not a recommended amount that consumers should eat, but rather provides reference amounts that were identified by national surveys of amounts that consumers tend to eat. The RAC gives us standard measures to encourage a level of uniformity across labeling. And Genesis R&D training sessions cover working with the RAC and serving sizes in much more detail. With the 2016 changes, some food categories like yogurt experienced a decrease in the RAC, and some food categories like some of the beverages and ice cream, sugars, and others experienced an increase in the RAC. So you want to refer to the 2016 RAC to be sure that your current serving sizes agree with the updated reference amounts. Here's an example demonstrating a change to serving size based on the updated RAC, as well as the effects that these changes would have on eligible nutrient content claims. With the 2016 RAC, the serving size for yogurt decreased from 225 grams to 170 grams, which represents an amount closer to many of those individual container sizes that we see on the market. So this makes sense. Notice that as you adjust the serving size to match the rack, obviously the nutritional content per serving decreases. The calcium content per serving decreases, and the calcium claim that previously was stated as excellent source of calcium based on that 20% of the DV can no longer be made. On the new label, calcium now provides 10% of the DV, which rather than an excellent source claim qualifies as a good source claim for calcium. So be aware that the rack changes can certainly affect multiple components of your package labeling. Included in the updated regulations is a requirement for dual column labels on individual units and containers that are 200% to 300% of the rack. So this rule also takes into account changes to those rack amounts. The dual column requirement acknowledges the fact that many consumers might find it reasonable to consume an entire container of product in one sitting, regardless of the stated serving size. And this additional information provides consumers with the opportunity to make more informed choices, or at least offers feedback in their dietary behaviors. So if your package weighs at least 200% and up to including 300% of the rack, then in most cases, you must include a dual column label that presents the rack determined serving size in the first column and the nutritional information for the entire unit or container in the second column. Of course, there are exceptions to the dual column rule. The dual column label can be omitted or alternative information presented for a variety of products or circumstances. The dual column can be, or here you can see the exemptions to dual column listed here, including small packages that meet the criteria for tabular and linear label formats. So if you don't have enough room on your package for labeling, you can opt to omit that second column that is typically required on those products. Or for packages that state voluntarily as packaged, or excuse me, you must state the as packaged, but if you voluntarily choose to declare as prepared form of the food, then you wouldn't have to include the full container. So you wouldn't have a 3-column label, you would just declare as packaged and as prepared. And you can see other exemptions here. So consider what information is most useful to your customers and be aware of the requirements and your available options. As we've seen throughout the release of the 2016 labeling rules, some of the label topics have been evolving, and the FDA has released draft guidance and final guidance to present current thinking and clarification on a number of points, like compliance dates, dietary fiber, added sugars, the rack, and others. Sometimes the guidance helps to explain and solidify the requirements of the regulations, and in other instances, this guidance may directly affect the physical look and the format of the labels. Final rule in the CFR uses the word shall to indicate a requirement. FDA guidance uses the word should to mean that something is suggested or recommended as an option, but not necessarily required. And we see the phrase FDA intends to exercise enforcement discretion repeatedly in the guidance documents. This means that the FDA does not intend to object to certain declarations or claims that fall within the framework of the guidance. When you see this term, it doesn't mean you get a free pass to edit the label information in any way you want. It does mean, though, that the FDA may consider context, intent, and the overarching objectives regarding some aspects of the regulation, and will allow you a certain amount of flexibility to accommodate industry and consumer needs. Often we might see that the industry adopts the options set forth in guidance as the common practice that is used. An example of clarification provided by the FDA was guidance released in November of 2018. The FDA provided us with updated guidance called Nutrition and Supplement Facts Labels, questions and answers related to the compliance date, added sugars, and declaration of quantitative amounts of vitamins and minerals, guidance for industry. In all of that included was previously released as draft guidance, but now final guidance, clear direction on reporting the quantitative amounts of vitamins and minerals on the label. Remember that with the 1990 label, we only had to declare %DV for the vitamins and minerals in the bottom portion of the label. The 2016 label, however, requires declaration of the quantitative amount for the vitamins and minerals on most standard formats, along with the %DV. There are some exceptions where you can exclude the quantitative amounts, but for most labels, we would have both quantitative and %DV. By default, Genesis reports the quantitative amount rounded to a whole number or a reasonable decimal place for small amounts, which is in line with the CFR as originally written. Genesis includes the option for the label to report a rounded quantitative value that is in line with the levels of significance set forth in the November 2018 guidance document. An example might be that by default, potassium you'd see reported as 31 milligrams, but by selecting the FDA guidance option, you'd see potassium reported as 30 milligrams, which may be viewed as more consumer friendly. A great example of rule that has been evolving and guidance has presented us with new options is added sugars. Added sugars is new to the label, and declaration may take a fair amount of consideration depending on the nature of your product and the information that your suppliers can provide. Let's back up to the original definition presented in the final rule. Per the CFR, added sugars are sugars that are either added during the processing of foods or packaged as such, and includes sugars, free mono and disaccharides, sugars from syrups, and sugars concentrated from fruit or vegetable juices that are in excess of what would be expected from the same volume of 100% fruit or vegetable juice of the same type. So examples of these are white, brown, cane, turbinado sugars, dextrose, fructose, glucose, and others, honey, molasses, and syrups like agave syrup, high fructose corn syrup, and maple syrup. We also see juice concentrates in some cases declared as added sugars. We have a webinar from earlier this year that is dedicated to added sugars, so I refer you to that webinar for more detail, but today I kind of want to catch you up on where we are at with the latest guidance. To accommodate the new definition, we have to discern between the sugars that exist naturally in whole foods, ingredients that meet the FDA definition of added sugars, and foods and ingredients that contain a mixture of naturally occurring and added sugars. So you can have a whole food like an apple where all of the sugars contained in the apple exist as naturally occurring. For a fresh apple, you would report total sugars, but none of the sugars contained in the whole fresh apple would be considered added sugars. So you would report added sugars as 0. You can have an ingredient that meets the FDA definition of added sugars, like white granulated sugar or honey. When these ingredients are used in other foods, then they count as added sugars and must be declared as such on the label of the finished food. So when using sugar ingredients in finished products, all of the total sugars reported for that type of ingredient would also be reported as added sugars. This is how we report sugar ingredients in the ESHA database. We do that in the approach of we consider most Genesis users are using those type of ingredients in other formulas. So for ESHA database ingredients, you'll see for white sugar, total sugar and added sugars would be equal values. And you do have to keep track of sugars that occur naturally in whole foods, as well as sugars that come from the ingredients that count towards added sugars. In mixed foods, know which ingredients or portions of ingredients contribute to the added sugars. And sometimes you'll need to contact your suppliers for more clarification, especially at this point in the process. Everyone is still kind of getting up to speed with reporting accurately. In Genesis, we have 2 separate fields. One is total sugars and one is added sugars. And both of these must be populated for all ingredients to report accurate information on your labels. And again, you may want to refer to the previous recorded added sugars webinar for more detail. In December 2018, the Farm Bill stated that food labeling regulation shall not require the includes so many grams of added sugars on packages of single ingredient sugar products. On the packaging of items like white sugar, brown sugar, honey, maple syrup, etc., the label would not require added sugars declaration. In June 2019, the FDA clarified in guidance what the label should look like for these single ingredient sugar products. Per the guidance, the label of single ingredient sugar products can omit the added sugars text and the quantitative value, but the %DV is to remain. In addition, the FDA encourages use of a dagger symbol that refers to a statement at the bottom but within the nutrition facts label that further describes the added sugars content. You can see an example of how this label looks here. The FDA example footnote states, 1 serving adds 17 grams of sugar to your diet and represents 34% of the DB for added sugars. The FDA guidance also extends the compliance date for 2016 labeling of single ingredient sugar products to July 1st, 2021. So you can see here that we have some very different looking labels and added sugars information presented depending on the nature of the finished food or the individual ingredient. An apple reports 0 added sugars. A mixed food might report total sugars and added sugars with equal or different values. It depends on the mixture of naturally occurring sugars and added sugar ingredients. And note that the added sugars quantitative value should never be greater than your total sugars value. A single ingredient sugar product like sugar or honey can list the added sugars per the guidance showing only the %DV. Here we also show the dagger symbol listed on the added sugars line and a clarifying note in the lower portion of the label. And certain sweetened cranberry products can also include a dagger symbol on the added sugars line, but for those products, the added sugars text and quantitative value must be included on the label, and the explanatory statement regarding sugars added for palatability is placed outside of the label on the package. Genesis includes 3 of these options already, and the single ingredient sugar option will be available soon. Dietary fiber has also been a topic of much consideration and conversation in terms of the 2016 labeling rules. We have a full tutorial from earlier this year devoted to dietary fiber, so please take a look at that as well. Today I want to highlight a few of the most recent points. Dietary fiber is still listed in grams in the same location on the label. The daily value used to calculate the %DV increased from 25 grams on the 1990 label to 28 grams on the 2016 label. So this is one of the nutrients that could potentially show a lower %DV with no change to the quantitative amount per serving. With the 2016 labeling updates, however, the FDA adopted a specific definition for dietary fiber. Not all ingredients that previously contributed to dietary fiber count as dietary fiber on the 2016 label. So with no change to your formula, the quantitative amount of dietary fiber reported on the label could potentially decrease. The ingredients that do or do not meet the definition has been evolving, and we're seeing continued updated guidance on dietary fiber. The term non-digestible carbohydrates is much more apparent in the 2016 regulations. All dietary fibers are non-digestible carbohydrates, but not all non-digestible carbohydrates are considered dietary fiber for 2016 US labeling. And physiologically beneficial is a key component of the 2016 FDA dietary fiber definition. According to the CFR for 2016 labeling, dietary fiber is defined as non-digestible, soluble, and insoluble carbohydrates with 3 or more monomeric units and lignin that are intrinsic and intact in plants, as well as isolated or synthetic non-digestible carbohydrates with 3 or more monomeric units determined by FDA to have physiological effects that are beneficial to human health. As part of the definition, we have dietary fiber that occurs as intact and intrinsic in whole foods, like fiber in produce, grains, and cereals. We also have a list of ingredients that are or contain isolated non-digestible carbohydrates that meet the FDA 2016 definition of dietary fiber because they have shown to provide physiological benefit to humans. These isolated dietary fibers include the list you see here. Note that many, like mixed plant cell wall fibers and resistant starch 2, represent a larger list of ingredients. More detail is covered in the dietary fiber webinar that I mentioned, and much more is covered in our Genesis R&D trainings. At this time, we have a list from the FDA of isolated non-digestible carbohydrates that have not yet shown evidence of benefit or haven't been announced as showing physiological benefit. But we want to keep an eye on this list. Some of these could move forward to the list of beneficial isolated dietary fibers, and it is possible that others could be introduced over time. These are subject to petition, so the industry, suppliers, FDA may take a look at some components or some isolated non-digestible carbohydrates and evaluate whether they are beneficial to human health. At this time, however, the ingredients that you see on this list do not count towards dietary fiber for 2016 labeling. With Genesis, we have several dietary fiber fields, related fields, that you would want to maintain as part of the record keeping required for US labeling. The total dietary fiber fields, those highlighted in green here, indicate dietary fiber reported in relation to the 1990 US labels, as well as fiber outside of US regulation. That's total dietary fiber. The middle blue section shows the dietary fiber 2016 fields. These are specifically for reporting dietary fiber values on the US 2016 label, and those are considered beneficial by FDA definition. So that's dietary fiber 2016. The bottom pink fields represent the non-beneficial, non-digestible carbohydrates. So the portion of the non-digestible carbohydrates that don't meet the FDA 2016 definition of dietary fiber. And you want to fill in as much of those fields as you can. Per the CFR, manufacturers must make and keep records verifying the declared amount of dietary fiber in the labeling of a food when a mixture of dietary fiber and added non-beneficial, non-digestible carbohydrates is present in the food. In an ideal world, we would see data sheets that provide the full picture of the dietary fiber 2016 value, as well as the total non-digestible carbohydrates value, so that we can document the necessary information. Unfortunately, we don't always see that amount of detail, so communication with suppliers is essential. You may need to ask your suppliers if they can provide more information to be sure to document your attempts at obtaining more detail about your ingredients. In this example data sheet, if the item contains a mixture of dietary fiber and non-beneficial, non-digestible carbohydrates, and the supplier might report total dietary fiber and 2016 dietary fiber detail, then you really have all the information necessary and you can fill in those fields. In Genesis R&D, if you do not populate the dietary fiber 2016 field, then your label may look like the 2016 label shown here, with dashes in the dietary fiber line. This is obviously not a compliant label. This is an example where all the ingredients in the formula are missing the value in the dietary fiber 2016 field. But note that if only some of your ingredients report dietary fiber 2016, a value will show on the label. But if you haven't populated all of those ingredients with the dietary fiber 2016 data, the label could underreport dietary fiber. This is why you want to review the spreadsheet report for all of your recipes. On the spreadsheet, dashes indicate missing data, and you'll want to fill that data in for the ingredient record of any ingredients that show dashes for nutrients that you're reporting on your labels. So take a look at your spreadsheet and get all of those fields populated. It's true for all nutrients that you're reporting, but for 2016 labeling, pay special attention to dietary fiber 2016, added sugars, vitamin D, and potassium, because just like you, your suppliers may be in the process of transitioning to the 2016 data. Genesis includes several predetermined nutrient sets found in the Nutrients to View settings. These are the nutrients that you see on screen when you're working with ingredients and recipes, as well as on reports like the multi-column report, the spreadsheet, and others. The Nutrients to View does not determine the nutrients that you see on your labels. Those are selected through the Edit Label features, so just keep that in mind. But when you click on the Nutrients to View button in Genesis, you see all of the nutrient sets available, as well as a check mark next to the set that you have selected. This may be the default set, which is about 60 nutrients, and you will see sets for the US and other country labeling purposes that can include the mandatory nutrients as well as all nutrients allowed for each country. You can select a different set of nutrients to view at any time. Just click on any in the list available. And you can also create new customized sets of nutrients to view. An example of a set that I've used in the transitioning of labels is a 2016 mandatory set of nutrients with the addition of total dietary fiber. So that allows me to see a reference of the old fiber value that was reported on my 1990 labels and gives me a, is it greater than, is it missing, or some kind of reference for my 2016 dietary fiber value. So when working with nutrients to view in Genesis, consider creating sets that will help you improve your workflow. For best practice and compliance, you want to maintain thorough documentation of how you arrived at the information reported on your labels. In Genesis, we provide you with opportunity to attach files directly to your ingredient records and to your recipes. And supporting documentation might include spec sheets from your suppliers, your formulations, obviously, batch records, lab and database analyses, either for a full product or for one single nutrient, adjustments like moisture or vitamin loss, calculations like for dietary fiber or your added sugars, and references to regulatory documentation or perhaps communication that you've received from the FDA in response to direct inquiries. So if something was in their question and you ask for clarification, document those replies and communications. You want to create a clear trail of information for each recipe. And again, a brief recap of points to consider as you transition to the 2016 labels. Did any of your formulas or ingredients change? Did the rack for any of your products change? Does your package require a dual column label based on the individual unit or container that is 200 to 300% of the rack? Are your existing nutrient content claims still supported by your 2016 labels? You want to use the spreadsheet report in Genesis to find and populate missing nutrient values. You may need to contact suppliers for updated information that supports the 2016 labels. You want to review your dietary fiber information and document any sources that you have. And you want to determine the added sugars value in ingredients and calculate and document added sugars for finished products. And one last slide for me to share. I want to remind you that the ESHA database contains values to support the 2016 labels for some but not all ingredients. So just as you have experienced with your suppliers, the availability of 2016 nutrient data is still developing. We update the items included in the ESHA database as quickly as possible and will continue to do so. You just want to review the spreadsheet for all of your recipes as part of your standard process and fill in the blanks where needed. Maintaining your software support will also provide you with continued updated features and data. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to Ben to show you features and options in Genesis that support and help you create the 2016 labels.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alicia. We're going to switch gears a little bit, go into the software now. We won't spend too much time in the software, but just a handful of things that we wanted to point out and kind of go through. The first one being the overall preferences of your software. So under the Home tab, going into My Preferences. And one of the huge pieces for the new regulations is going to be what regulation your default is for Genesis overall. This is a personal preference. So if one person in your organization changes it, it doesn't change it for everyone. It's just going to be that individual's preference. But if you've used Genesis prior to the new labels being introduced into Genesis, your default will be US 1990, and you'll want to go in and change that default into 2016. So for those that are using maybe older versions that are looking at upgrading out, make sure you change that out. We didn't want to force too many changes to preferences from an individual or from an overall standpoint or a recipe standpoint before you were ready. So just make sure that when you're ready to make that change, you switch that over within the preferences. And then the other thing that Alicia pointed out a little bit here is going to be nutrients to view. Again, your default generally is just going to be the Genesis default set, but if you wanted to switch it to a more specific set for the set of regulations that you're working with, and currently I have 1990 selected for the mandatory nutrients. If I want to switch that to 2016, click on that, and now that's what will be shown in my reports. As Alicia mentioned, that's not affecting your label. Label settings are completely different. I'll go into that in just a second as well. Report nutrients and label nutrients are definitely a very, very different beings that are separate. And then also you can do customized sets as well. So if you wanted just to show the 9 fiber fields for a set of nutrients to view just those all at once, you can do that. And interestingly enough, I created one just for that. So I've got fibers right here. And if you want to create your own, you simply go into the modify box here, edit, and then select the nutrients that you would like. You know, the nutrients on the right are the ones that are currently selected in this set of nutrients to view. The ones on the left are the rest of the nutrients inside of the database. So I've just got about 9 selected right here. Nothing else is selected. You can just go and save as and save that set of nutrients, and it'll just add that to your top list here. The top list are user created sets. Bottom list are the default sets. I'm gonna switch it back to mandatory 2016 so that we can use that when we go into an actual recipe. I'm gonna go ahead and open up a recipe now. Just open up my kind of default webinar sample chopped salad recipe. And we'll take a look at the nutrition label, and we'll go through some of those label settings so that we can see some of those changes. Right now, I've got a 1990 label shown. If I go into edit label, we have those settings for the label. Similar to the overall preferences, this is a very important piece here. The regulation that you're using for this recipe will not change when you upgrade versions. So if you have a recipe created and it's using a 1990 label, that label won't change until you go into the label settings and change it to 2016 yourself. A lot of that is because, as Alicia just went through over the last 40-ish minutes, there's a huge amount of difference between the old regulations and the new. You want to make sure added sugars are set, potassium, vitamin D, your fiber makes sense. So you make sure all of that is in place before you're then changing that existing recipe to a new label. If you create a new recipe, it's just going to be based on that preference that I showed you before. So if you have 2016 set as your preferences, any new recipe you create is going to be a 2016 label. You just have to make sure for those existing recipes that you're switching them over as you need. We looked at a little bit of the dual column labeling as we went through some of those slides. That's going to be under the style. Nope, label, sorry, wrong one. Under the label, so if I click on label here, instead of just being an adult standard nutrition label, I can do the dual column single recipe. That's going to be for if you have a product that is the 200 to 300% where you need to show the serving size and the full package for one product. This isn't going to be the case where you do as packaged as prepared, or popcorn as packaged and popped, something like that. That would be inside of the advanced label setting, because you're going to have separate recipes for each of the different columns. As packaged, as prepared. The as prepared is going to have additional products inside of the recipe. Cereal and cereal with milk, the cereal is then adding milk. It's not the same recipe. So you have to have 2 separate recipes, select them from there. We do have a webinar that goes over advanced labels and those sorts of things. So if you do want to look at some more advanced topics on creating those sorts of labels, I encourage you to go look at that. But for the single recipe dual column, you have a few settings down the bottom here. You have the column 1 header and then the column 2 header. So you can name those columns. Column 1, we'd say per serving. And then column 2, we say per package, however you'd like to state that. And then the container size is the second column, being however much you want. My serving size is currently 100 grams per serving. So if it was a 250 gram package, now hit OK, and I'll redraw that label up for the new regs with that dual column. So now we have the first column being per serving, which is 100 grams. The second one is going to be per package, which is the 250 grams. Going back into the settings, there was a lot of talk about the draft guidance, or now the final guidance for the new rounding. And that's going to be under the format options, along with the added sugars pieces as well. So if you wanted to use the 2018 draft guidance or final guidance for nutrition rounding, just check that box here to change that. Same with, again, the added sugars. We're adding some more of those settings for added sugars. We do have some of it already sitting here. So those settings are going to be right here within the format options, so long as you have a 2016 label selected. If this is a US 1990 label, those format options are not going to be the same. They're not going to exist. So you have to make sure you're using the new regulations to get the new regulations settings that go along with it. Let's back here and go into edit recipe. Alicia talked a little bit about the nutrient calculator, and we do have that here as well. So you can see if we do auto calculations, it'll automatically calculate if I enter a value into a nutrient, or we can go in and calculate nutrients here. A big part of this would be, if you do have that dietary fiber field that isn't finished up, and you want to have the recipe auto calculated over. A lot of these you do want to do inside of the ingredient as well, so that's an important piece of a lot of overrides in your recipes when you could just go in and fix the ingredients is a huge part of that as well. But the override values are here. And if you do a calculation with the nutrient calculator, it is going to add that to the override field. It's not changing the actual value of the nutrient. It's adding an override in the override column here. And then, as we always love to show, spreadsheet report. Spreadsheet report, so much of the spreadsheet report. Always take a look at that report. Again, if I wanted to go over back into my nutrients to view and change to like the fibers specific view and just view those 9 nutrients, we can view just that. And you see I've got some missing fields here because I'm just using kind of a default recipe that I've created in the past, but you can see total fiber is in this column here, and then fiber 2016 is here, and you do see that both are completely filled. But if you're using a user created ingredient that maybe that had total fiber and didn't have 2016, we'd see some missing values here, so you can kind of see the comparison and contrast there. And then one last piece that I wanted to go through is the nutrient content claims. So we've got the nutrient content claim value for what it's based on, which is going to be the reference amount. That also will change based on which regulation set you're in. And so we'll ask that question again if you change from a 1990 to a 2016 label. Currently, reference amount based on 2016 because I have a 2016 label. So if you've done a nutrient content claim for a 1990 label in the past, and you change your label to 2016, it will pop open this window again asking what the reference amount is. Do you want it to be what the serving size is? Do you want it to enter in your own to allow that? So it will change with the changing of the label as well. And that was about all I had for kind of going into the application itself. If you're like me and you feel like you need some more training on this, we do have a few training sessions coming up. Our next one is August 20th through 22nd. I've mentioned this the last couple of webinars, but I'll mention it again. We've kind of overhauled the way our training works. It used to be you go to either a 2-day professional or a 2-day advanced training. We've kind of merged those together to now be 3 total days, and you can choose either the first 2 days, which are kind of the professional piece, the 3rd day being the advanced piece, or obviously you can do all 3 days together. So we've tried to make it a little bit more flexible for everyone to not have to go to 2 separate trainings, to be able to go to one and get all of that information, and also have the professional advance more often because we're not having to alternate. We're doing all of it all at the same time. The last one there, we've got December 4th and 5th is only a 2-day, and it's a menu label training, so it's more of a restaurant focus inside of the training. So if you do our restaurant sort of business, that would be a great training for you. Before we get into the questions, if we don't get to your question or didn't answer your question that you put into the question and answer panel, we will do our best to follow up with you. If you have a question, or if it was just a really specific question, we probably won't answer it live as we're talking right here, but give us a call, shoot us an email, whether it's a sales question, a support question, a nutrition question, a question for our consulting team. Give us a call, shoot us an email. We'll help with those questions one-on-one after the fact as well. And we have a ton of helpful resources online, our LinkedIn page, our blog, e-newsletter, e-learning center, all that information, and of course our webinars that we've done in the past as well. So getting into a couple of questions now. Our first question for you, Alicia, is the 2020 label for the FDA available in Genesis?
In Genesis, the label is referred to as the 2016 label. So we hear some people call it the 2020 label, but we call it the 2016 label. We call it that because the new regulations went into effect in 2016, and it is compliant with these 2020 compliant dates that we're talking about. So it's all the same label, compliant with the current FDA requirements, and it's available in Genesis.
Fantastic. We just talked about the training coming up for the menu labeling. What was the compliance date for menu labeling?
Oh, sure. For menu labeling, the mandatory compliance date was May 7th, 2018. So that's already well underway. And as Ben just said, we have that training session coming up that focuses on the menu labeling. So again, go to the ESHA website if you need more information about registering for that.
All right. What is a uniform compliance date?
Yes, I've seen a little bit of confusion from some folks about compliance date, uniform compliance date. So for uniform compliance date, FDA sets a uniform compliance date or dates to lump final rules that occur in a certain time period together. They want to minimize the impact of changes in that certain time period, so that if they can coordinate a set of compliance dates, they'll set one and kind of set that as the target for any rules that go into effect to use a standard compliance date or that same uniform compliance date. For example, in December of 2018, the FDA announced that final food regulations issued during the 2019 and 2020 calendar years will have a uniform compliance date of January 1st, 2022. So those are final rules that we see this year, and next year would likely fall or have a compliance date of January 1st, 2022. What we're talking about today, the 2016 regulations, those were set with an original compliance date of 2018, and then that date was extended to January 1st, 2020. So again, all this regulation we're talking about today, with the exception of those sugar ingredient items and extension for small businesses, you're working off of the January 1st, 2020 compliance date. Good question.
All right, our next question. Can I use the dietary fiber value from my old label to report in the 2016 label?
Not necessarily. So depending on the ingredients that your formula contains, and if those ingredients contain isolated, non-beneficial, non-digestible carbohydrates, the dietary fiber reportable on the label may have changed. So just go back to your reviewing your spreadsheet to make sure values are filled in, and review your ingredients to see if they contain, or if they are, any of those isolated, non-digestible carbohydrates that are not considered beneficial. You cannot count them if they don't provide physiological benefit.
This next one sounds like a little bit of maybe a concerning red flag. My label shows added sugar higher than my total sugar. Why would that be?
There might be a couple reasons, but again, yeah, you don't want your added sugars reporting as greater than your total sugars on your label. That is certainly a red flag. If you see this, you want to look at the spreadsheet report, of course, as you do for all of your recipes, as you know, and then look at the ingredients and the added sugars column and the total sugars columns. So just scale down or glance down your list of ingredients on the spreadsheet report and see if any single nutrient or any single ingredient is reporting added sugars higher than total sugars. Oftentimes we might see where entry missed a decimal place, and so you may just be an entry error that you need to correct. And so go back to your ingredient record, make the correction to added sugars, and then that will pull forward to your recipe.
All right, our next question. My label shows 62 milligrams of potassium as 2% of the daily recommended value. However, when I do the math, 62 comes out to about 1.32% of 4,700, the DRI for potassium. What rounding is taking place here?
Very specific question, but this is a great example and a topic that has come up. For vitamins and minerals on the nutrition facts label, the CFR states that the percent DB shall be rounded to the nearest 2% when the percent is 2% up to and including 10%. So if the percent DB is less than 2%, you have some options. By default, Genesis rounds the 1.32 up to 2%. It's rounding to the nearest 2%, and it reports that on the label. In this example, you could choose to report potassium as 0 on the label if you felt that that was more representation or a better representation of the product. So clearly states on your label zeros and agrees and is not confusing to consumers. So in the edit label settings and the nutrient options, you can find additional options for vitamins and minerals, like reporting less than 2% DBs as 0.
Fantastic. Will Genesis still include the 1990 label after January 1st, 2020?
Yes, it will. And again, we didn't want to strip that out of there. For one, it's not time yet, and we won't remove the 1990 label until it would be prudent to do so. So remember that some manufacturers have the extended date of the 2021, and then the single ingredient sugar products have until July 1st, 2021. So just like we didn't automatically switch everyone's labels when the 2016 format was available, we won't remove the 1990 until it's time to do so. We want you to have a chance to, again, create documentation, create a snapshot in time of your existing labels so you have that on record. And that's certainly part of this transition process, to create thorough documentation.
All right, we have time for just maybe another question or two. What if I need to create a dual column label for as packaged and as prepared? How is that done?
Sure. So in Genesis, typically when you're working with a single recipe, you can create the dual column label in Genesis, but that's more for again, this requirement of the 200 to 300%. So you'd have a column for your as packaged serving size and then the full container. In Genesis, with the advanced label settings, and we have webinars and tutorials, more instruction on advanced labels, but that's where you can create a label that would give you 2 columns, 1 column for as packaged and 1 column for as prepared. That kind of label takes 2 different recipes. So you create 2 recipes in Genesis, and then you can combine those recipes or that information on 1 label in the advanced label settings.
All right, I think we have time for one last question. Do the 2016 label changes apply to supplement facts too?
Yes, but there are differences in some of the formatting between the nutrition facts for food and the supplement facts for dietary supplement products. A couple of the major changes are that supplement facts formatting doesn't list calories in that big bold text. This is because many dietary supplements don't provide significant, or they're not significant sources of calories per serving. So it's not as critical to pull your attention to the calories information. But probably the biggest change will be the percent dBs reported for formulas that go unchanged, or needs to, your percent dBs if you don't want those to change, but you may need to reformulate now to come up with a product that provides the same percent dB. So say your product, your supplement is providing 100% dB of a certain nutrient, but the underlying daily value has changed. So now you may need to reformulate to create a product that hits those 100% dBs. So not just reviewing of labels, but reviewing of formulations and consideration there for dietary supplements.
Perfect. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I want to point out one more time, if you do have any questions as you move forward or rewatch this again, feel free to reach out to us at any time. Support our nutrition teams, our sales team, if you have questions about your existing account, or if you're not a current user of Genesis and you wanted to look at getting it for your labeling compliance. So thank you all for joining us today, and have a great evening.